I start by providing a brief background on this topic. My research is presented in the form of 2 studies. My review focuses on cataloging and summarizing existing literature. My critical analysis looks at the ways that racial and gender identities are constructed through language. In the end, I provide insights for future research. The progress bar is located here. The term natural resources includes the fields of forestry, fisheries, wildlife, rangelands, and natural resources management. Because there are many types of diversity in natural resources, I use the term demographic diversity to make it clear that my work focuses on people. Discourse can be understood as all the varieties of talk and text, including written, spoken, and visual forms of communication. Therefore, the term discourse of demographic diversity refers to the formal study of language. My research focuses on scholarly literature, which is the most enduring form of communication in many science disciplines. Demographic diversity has been a prominent topic of discussion within natural resources literature for quite some time. This has to do with the fact that natural resources remained almost exclusively white and male until the 1970s. Over time, more publications have focused on the race, ethnicity, and gender of the natural resources workforce. My study's contributions are aimed at 2 research gaps: the absence of a comprehensive review, which leads to an abbreviated understanding of the literature on this topic. Relatively few studies consider the assumptions embedded within everyday language in the discourse of diversity in natural resources. This leads to the common acceptance of terms that are highly problematic and exclusionary. My work is based on a qualitative research approach that relies on 3 different methods. For the first study, I conducted a systematic review and content analysis. Unlike literature reviews, systematic reviews use strict guidelines to catalog bodies of literature. Qualitative content analyses provide descriptive summaries. I conducted a critical discourse analysis on a subset of literature. The interpretations from critical discourse analyses are useful for revealing the ways that power and oppression are produced through language. In sum, I collected the articles, I summarized them, and I analyzed the language within them. Systematic reviews have 4 main steps. The literature in my review was identified using 6 search strategies applied to 3 databases and 4 journals. As you will see below, less than 4% of all the identified literature was included in my review. To determine which articles were included in my review, I used 6 criteria, such as the discipline, the types of literature, and whether or not the publications focused on the United States. This step focused on removing duplicates, reading each article, and applying the inclusion criteria. Out of 260 publications that were included in my review, 185 were published in a scientific journal or magazine, and 65 were not published. The final literature included topics such as workforce diversity, multiculturalism, and diversity and inclusion. My collection of articles will be made available to the public in the near future. I conducted a qualitative content analysis to describe the patterns within language. In total, my analysis included 14 criteria within 3 main categories. Descriptive metadata is used to identify components of a publication, such as the title and journal. Authorship data provides information about the authors of each publication, such as their geographic location. Scholarly characteristics focuses on the presence of components such as an abstract, a method section, and a reference list. For the sake of time, I present 3 findings from my content analysis. The oldest literature in my review dates back to 1919 and 1920. Both articles focus on the roles that women played in forestry mills and as forest fire lookouts due to the labor shortage from World War I. My review did not include any literature from 1921 to 1970. This gap may be tied to how hard it is to access articles that were published before the rise of online journals. The number of articles significantly increased after 1970, perhaps in response to the civil rights movement. There were 375 authors included in my review. This large body of authors is illustrative of a general concern about the shifting demographics in natural resources. Unfortunately, 81% of authors wrote only one publication on this topic. Thus, only 19% of authors engage with this topic on a long-term repetitive basis. I categorize publications into 6 mutually exclusive groups. The most frequent types of publications in descending order were reports, opinion pieces, and original research articles. While one of my goals was to be comprehensive, there is still the possibility that relevant studies were not included in my systematic review. My review does not include literature published after October of 2018, so this body of literature will have to be updated in the future. Future research on this topic can attempt to fill the gap from 1921 to 1970. I find it hard to imagine that publications on this topic completely ceased after 1921. I find it more plausible that there are other reasons as to why the literature on this topic is not showing up in certain databases or journals. Future reviews can also rely on different types of literature, such as books, oral histories, and archives at the Forest History Society and the National Museum of Forest Service History. In sum, my findings reveal that natural resources literature has undoubtedly played an important and enduring role in documenting demographic diversity. To support sustained attention and expertise on this topic, I suggest the development of multi-institutional partnerships. Going forward, scholars must consider the future direction of the discourse of diversity in natural resources literature. So, this brings me to the second study. Content analyses are useful for providing summaries, but are not well suited for understanding hidden meanings within language. Fortunately, critical discourse analyses provide rigorous interpretations of language within text and talk. Critical discourse analysis is a theory and method that focuses on social inequalities and power structures. My critical analysis examines how racial and gender identities are constructed within the discourse of diversity. The term critical is derived from critical theory, which confronts issues of power, privilege, and inequality. With this in mind, social identities are not objective or natural. Instead, they can be understood as socially constructed, built, or established. Race and gender are understood as 2 of the most enduring concepts within the discourse of diversity in higher education. My work views race and gender as overlapping structures of power that divide and organize society. The relationship between race and gender can be explained with the notion race makes gender and gender makes race, with each having the ability to shape or establish the other. Language is the primary vehicle used to produce biases, discrimination, and hidden assumptions. Therefore, Language cannot be seen as a neutral vehicle for communication. Discourse includes all the varieties of talk and text. It is important to study power dynamics within texts because power permeates every aspect of society, including discourse. My use of the term power does not refer to individuals, but instead refers to social power that is organized systemically. My theoretical framework has 3 components. Critical diversity studies considers questions such as, what does the discourse of diversity do or accomplish? My work recognizes diversity as both a concept and a set of practices that are employed within various ways and institutions. Critical race theory centrally locates race and racism as embedded structures of US society. Critical race theory asserts that racism is an ordinary occurrence within the everyday life of marginalized groups. Intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, recognizes how overlapping axes of oppression shape an individual's life. My intersectional perspective acknowledges the fluidity of social identities. Together, this framework keeps systems of oppression and unequal power dynamics at the forefront of my analysis. I used Fairclough's 3-tier model for my analysis. Description of the text looks at what the text says or what wants to be said within the text. The next layer looks at what is done within the discourse in order to understand its purpose and function. Building on the 2 previous layers, I offer an explanation of what the discourse implies or how the discourse operates based on the systems of power and ideologies. My analysis focused on a sample of 15 original research articles that spanned from 1986 to 2018. I chose this type of literature due to the stringent parameters and intercodal reliability measurements. During my analysis, I read each article several times, created a codebook, and assigned labels to concepts using in vivo. I stopped coding once I reached thematic saturation. I also recorded my personal reflections using analytic memos. From there, I identified the major themes which I report on next. My findings focus on 2 overarching themes. The language of diversity focuses on the terms used to describe different groups of people, such as non-white and traditional. Demographic statistics can be broadly defined as numerical measures that can be used to understand groups of people. I discussed the discourse of diversity in natural resources literature without naming particular authors because my goal is to call attention to broader patterns within the field. I use the term marked to consider how different social identities were positioned within the text. By marked, I mean named, discussed, or referred to. I found it interesting to see how this discourse attaches to certain bodies and detaches from others. I invite you to consider who is marked as different by this discourse. Terms such as gender diversity or gender gap were mostly paired with references to women. Gender within the text only focused on men and women. Reinforcing the gender binary does not create space for fluid gender identities. Terms such as non-majority, non-white, and underrepresented were commonly paired with references to minorities and people of color. Again, race within the text reinforces whiteness as normal and ignores the existence of multiracial individuals. Next, I invite you to consider who is discussed as normal by this discourse. I considered why men and white people were typically absent from references to racial and gender diversity in natural resources. The unmarked member of any pair is the most natural, which in this context is clearly a place of power. Referring to marginalized groups as different means dominant groups are normal and therefore don't have to be labeled. In sum, the discourse of diversity in natural resources literature supplies whiteness and masculinity with just enough distance to remain unexamined. Finally, I considered who is erased or not mentioned within the text. For the sake of time, I focus on the lack of references to women of color. Articles commonly use the term women and minorities. Doing so leaves women as a raceless identifier. Furthermore, the separation of race and gender implies that these two categories do not intersect as they do with women of color. In sum, the language of diversity in natural resources literature erases groups such as women of color, multiracial individuals, and fluid gender identities. By focusing on diversity as different, this discourse reinforces whiteness and masculinity as normal. By no means am I expecting every term to be perfect. Instead, I am calling for scholars to reflect on the implications of the language that's being used. For my second theme, I considered the hidden meanings within numbers. Demographic statistics act as evidence of diversity in natural resources. 14 articles presented some form of demographic statistics. Here, I provide some examples for you to read and think about. Highlighting the smallest percentages of diversity puts forth the appearance of change, progress, and action. This is because increasing diversity is a socially desirable goal. Despite the heavy reliance on numbers, every statistic tells a story, but no one statistic tells the whole truth. For the sake of time, I present one story that arises from demographic statistics: the narrative of underrepresentation. Demographic statistics were frequently paired with terms referring to the quantities of marginalized groups. To refer to the low abundance of women and people of color, 12 articles use language such as underrepresented, lack of, and relatively few. Below, I provide examples for your consideration. Next, I considered the ways in which issues of representation are also tied to power and social hierarchies. The term underrepresented primarily referred to marginalized groups within the text. For instance, the term underrepresented defines marginalized groups as inadequately represented or substantially below the comparable figure for white people. This term undoubtedly holds marginalized groups to the same standards as those of dominant groups. My findings reveal the various functions of the narrative of underrepresentation with regards to marginalized and dominant groups. This narrative frames marginalized groups as lacking or using a deficit perspective. By frame, I mean a way of looking at something or someone. For this part, I asked, what does this narrative attempt to accomplish or tell me about marginalized groups and natural resources? My findings suggest that this narrative frames marginalized groups as the problem. This was exemplified by the following language that was tied to marginalized groups within the text. My findings show that this language is directly tied to marginalized groups being framed as difficult to recruit, unqualified, and uninterested in natural resources. This narrative makes it acceptable, comforting, and faultless to say those women and minorities are not as abundant in natural resources. Instead of being understood as historically excluded, marginalized groups are understood as historically underrepresented. The positive side of this narrative is the argument that the demographics of a profession should be proportional or equal to that of the US population. But unfortunately, references to underrepresentation within the text that I analyzed were tethered to deficit ways of thinking. On the other hand, I asked, what does this narrative attempt to accomplish or hide with regards to dominant groups? Data from a study in 2012 found that the students of 67 forestry and natural resources academic programs were 86% white and 60% male. The narrative of underrepresentation helps change the perception of whiteness in natural resources. Instead of being perceived as predominantly white, natural resources is craftily repackaged as lacking diversity. This narrative successfully redirects and ignores questions about the overrepresentation of dominant groups. This narrative of underrepresentation makes the signs of exclusion disappear. To understand how this narrative makes the signs of exclusion disappear, I had to seek sources outside of those included in my review. Case in point, the forestry program at Arkansas A&M College, founded in 1909, purposefully denied African American applicants until 1964. Women at Northern Arizona University's forestry program, which was founded in 1958, were actively discouraged from majoring in forestry until the first women graduated in 1971. Not to mention Laura Conut at Oregon State University's College of Forestry, whose application was rejected in 1957 on the basis of her gender. In sum, demographic statistics serve several purposes. The same numbers that support the appearance of diversity also contribute to the creation of a useful story. The narrative of underrepresentation functions very differently for marginalized and dominant groups. Overall, this narrative substitutes systemic change with numbers and counting. In the end, this narrative successfully avoids naming whiteness as the problem. While critical discourse analyses provide useful interpretations of a problem or text, they do not provide absolute answers to a specific problem. As a result, additional research using action-oriented strategies is required to consider the ways to increase diversity in natural resources. Here, I outline 3 recommendations for future research on this topic. Critical analyses are required to advance the discourse of diversity in natural resources in a way that is attentive to structures of power and oppression. Inclusive language conveys respect to all people and is sensitive of differences. Future research on this topic should prioritize writing and speaking in a manner that is positive, respectful, and welcoming to all. Future research should view demographic inequities as symptoms of racist and sexist systems. Therefore, acknowledging power differences and histories of exclusion is imperative. My close reading of text demonstrates how power dynamics are embedded within the language of diversity and demographic statistics. My analysis provides insights that help understand the relationship between power, language, race, and gender. The principal finding of Article 2 is that the discourse of diversity fabricates and reinforces social difference, binaries, and numerical evidence. By engaging with critiques of diversity, I challenge the notion that diversity discourses are inaccessible from criticism and further assessment. My research attempts to provide starting points for difficult yet honest conversations about diversity in natural resources. The overarching goal for my thesis was to challenge the common ways of researching demographic diversity in natural resources. My review shows that an expansive body of literature exists on this topic, but also raises questions about its purpose and function. Despite the positive and well-intentioned nature of diversity, my research shines a light on the ways that diversity keeps whiteness in place. Ultimately, I ask several thought-provoking questions. What happens after calls to action for diversity are made within natural resources literature? Who is responsible for answering and implementing these calls to action? The author, the reader, or no one? Are we implicitly expecting marginalized groups to answer these calls to action? Going forward, we must consider questions such as these if we hope to continue shifting the demographics of natural resources. I anticipate the potential for intense reactions that may arise from my research. It is not considered polite to name whiteness, and most people believe it is downright rude. Ultimately, discomfort does not negate the truth of the findings presented here. As a result, I welcome transformative solutions and authentic dialogue that may emerge from my work. First, I would like to thank God for giving me the strength, the courage, and the will to reach this milestone. It would not have been possible without help from my Heavenly Father. I am grateful for my co-advisors, Brenda McComb and Dana Sanchez, for their collective guidance, expertise, and support. I express my sincerest appreciation to my committee members, Hannah Rimple, Marta Maldonado, Adam Schwartz, and Elizabeth Schroeder. I would also like to thank Wanda Cronell and Catherine Fields for their undying support and encouragement. Wanda would always tell me that success is the best revenge, and that was a quote I really held on to during my journey. I also would like to thank those who acted as mentors, teachers, and more, who helped mold me along the way, such as Rachel Reyna, Wilhelmina Bratton, Nancy Barnd, and many more. I thank OSU staff, such as Chris Nelson at the Grad Writing Center, my former CAPS therapist, and Clara LeBlanc at the library. I would not have gotten here were it not for the support I received from organizations such as Manners and the Society of American Foresters. I thank my close friends such as Milani, Sharanda, Colin, Johanna, and Nicole, and many more for sending me words of encouragement along the way. I thank my family and loved ones for never letting me give up on this dream and this degree. I thank my Nana for asking me every week if I'm done yet, and her being disappointed when I wasn't. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers, so I am happy to reach this milestone as a first-generation graduate student. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my ancestors. I express gratitude and appreciation for all the names I couldn't fit in this section. Your support is greatly appreciated nonetheless. Thank you for attending my defense. Considering that I have a limited amount of time for questions and feedback, I have created a separate tool which is called a Padlet to capture any remaining feedback, questions, words of encouragement, anything of the sort. I will paste the link for my Padlet in the chat box, or you can use your phone to scan the QR code that is on this slide. I will now be accepting questions using the chat box.
Great. Thank you, Jasmine, for that excellent presentation. Very thought-provoking. We're already starting to get some comments coming into the chat box. I'll moderate those and we'll ask questions. Mostly what I'm seeing in the chat box right now is a lot of congratulations about a great job. And I'd have to echo that. It really is excellent work.
I would just take a moment and invite everyone to unmute themselves very briefly so we can give Jasmine a hand and some celebrations. So. Did it.
Congratulations.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Brenda? Brenda, you're muted.
Thanks for that. Sorry, Dana. Sorry, everyone. There aren't any particular questions, but there was a comment that caught my attention, and I just wanted to see if you would comment on that, Jasmine. There are several comments that revolve around you calling out whiteness and the implicit expectation that marginalized groups should be addressing some of these issues rather than the dominant white folks with their work. And I wondered if you could just comment on that a little bit more. I think that's really an important message.
Was the question focusing on me having to say more about calling out whiteness and masculinity within the text? Or am I understanding the question rightly?
Yes, please.
So in terms of that, I know that personally, this was something I tried to avoid. For whatever reason, I came to this discourse assuming that people of color, that women were supposed to do the work of diversity. And it wasn't until I kept reading more and more, I was like, this isn't about me. This isn't about us. The stories I'm seeing within the text are doing something else. They're trying to hide and or conceal what the true issue is. And if we think about the demographics of our profession, it almost doesn't make sense to focus on groups that are so-called underrepresented. It's like you're only focusing on a slice of the pie without addressing the whole picture. So I don't know if that gets at the question or if there was something specific that person had wanted me to say, but I'm open to more questions.
Yeah, there really weren't questions, Jasmine, but I just wanted you to comment, and so you did. And that topic came up, what you just described came up in about a half dozen comments in the chat box. So I just wanted you to hear a bit more from you about that, and you did great. So thanks for that. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box and I'll pass them on. So there is one here. I think it looks like it's probably from Terry Sherrick, who says, I've observed that a lot of people care deeply about diversity and worked hard at changing demographics with little success. Why do you suppose this is the case? Are your strategies the answer?
That's an awesome question, Terry. Thank you so much for asking that. And I'm very fond of your work. With that question, I typically wonder what is our measure of success? What are we declaring as, ooh, we've accomplished this goal. Diversity is no longer, we've solved diversity. That part I still haven't understood. And that's something I'm still trying to understand myself. When we say accomplish, when we say success, what do we mean? What measures, what numbers, what percentages, what does that look like? Does it look like safe and welcoming work environments? Does it look like a profession that's more representative of our society? I'm still wondering what success looks like. In terms of thinking about barriers to success, I know that within the text, some studies had mentioned the lack of long-term budgets to sustain diversity efforts. And typically diversity efforts will happen in response to something. So whether it's a huge social movement, such as what we're experiencing right now, and then a lot of companies, a lot of industries will say, oh, diversity is important to us. It has to be a sustained long-term goal. This is not something that we pick up and put back down when it feels good for us. This has to be something that's baked into everything that we do. And as of right now, we still have a long way to go with that.
Thanks, Jasmine. I have a couple more questions that came in. One was, did you find any instances of non-binary language?
No, I did not, which was really surprising for me, knowing that I have friends. I have friends who are non-binary, and it was really tough for me to think about, okay, if I was not a cisgender woman, how would I read this text? If I wasn't heterosexual, how would I read this text? How would it be different to me? And I imagine that the language I'm seeing within text as a Black woman would be just as harmful, if not also exclusionary in that way.
Thank you. Wanda Cornell asked the question, does the use of underrepresented as a term serve to marginalize or minoritize individuals?
Oh, that's a really good question. I know personally, I've had people walk up to me and say, oh, I'm so happy to meet you. You're a non-white underrepresented forester. And I think sometimes we get caught up in slapping these labels onto people, but not realizing how these labels will impact how a person experiences a profession. When I think about the term underrepresented, that doesn't sound empowering. that makes it seem as if I am responsible for being excluded from a profession that was not welcoming to me. So in that way, I always try and think about like, what is underrepresented trying to accomplish? What are we trying to do with that word? For me personally, it doesn't feel empowering at all. And I don't label other people as underrepresented just because I know how much is wrapped up in that term.
Thank you. Maybe one more question and then we'll take a break here. There was a question about how to implement some of these ideas in some of the work that you're doing with children.
Oh, that is an awesome question. Hold on. I just pasted the link to my Padlet in the chat box. So for people who couldn't scan the QR code, you can click this link and it will take you somewhere else to provide feedback. In terms of implementing some of the strategies with children, I would say that's an area that I'm interested in myself, just from my work with high school students and middle school students. It always has me excited to think about different ways that we can get younger individuals excited for this profession. So in terms of thinking about language, I always think about like my family members, my young cousins who will see me and they're like, oh, Jasmine, you are the only forester that I know. So if I carry around all these labels, if I tell them, oh, I'm non-white, oh, I'm underrepresented, that doesn't work. That's not empowering. That doesn't make them get excited to also follow in my footsteps. So it's almost like we have to kind of train up people. This is how you talk to other people. This is how you use language that's welcoming to others. So that's more so what I would say.
Jasmine, I feel I am obligated to ask you one more question because it's from your dad.
Dad!
In your research, did you find any discussion on the overrepresentation of typically abled people within the natural resources?
Dad, upstairs in the living room. That's an awesome question. I did not find any reference to that. I'm aware of scholars that are doing other work on looking at disabilities within natural resources, how that impacts the way that someone might experience a park, a forest, a trail. I didn't find any mention to that. And it's really interesting to think about the traits that we use to identify people that I could not find within text. Like non-binary gender identities was not one. We weren't talking about disabilities. We're not talking about sexual orientation. So there's a lot of other things that shape how someone experiences life, that shape how someone's experiences a workforce that I'm not seeing talked about within the text. It's primarily like race, gender, and age are the main ones that I'm seeing right now. But thank you for that question, Dad.
So with that, we want to take a few minutes to let you catch your breath, Jasmine, before we go into the closed session. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. We had about 80 participants today, which I think reflects the amount of interest in the work that you're doing. So congratulations on a really great presentation, on some excellent questions that were asked, and just a lot of admiration for you and the work you're doing. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will go off to a closed session here in a few minutes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jasmine.